Hello, I'm Rick Anthony, and this is Caregiver Assist, a series of 30-minute interviews with experts in the field and women and men who are or have been caregivers for a loved one. Caregiving is a very complex situation. It's even more complex when you are providing caregiving remotely, thousands of miles from the care-dependent adult, especially when mom and dad are in Florida, several thousand miles away, and they will not come back. My guest today, Ira Wolf, was confronted with that situation. Ira is an expert in human resource management. He is a futurist in terms of the workforce of the future. He is an author of 6 books. He's a very busy guy. Therefore, I appreciate very much your taking the time, Ira, to be with me today. When you told me your story of taking care of your mother remotely, it was so reminiscent of other stories I've heard, some of them even more harrowing than yours, where it has been play a real toll on the caregiver, emotionally, financially, and so on. You seem to have gotten through it okay, but give me the background on your situation.
Yeah, thanks very much. And you're right, there's other stories that are much more harrowing, but it did bring to light the experience and the challenges that are associated with that. So my mother lived in Florida for almost 40 years. She moved there gradually, but full-time since the 90s. We were very fortunate because she was healthy. She was vibrant, and she,
even at age?
At 90, yeah, 90. She passed away at 99, just this last spring, a few months short of 100. But with that, she really, up until even through COVID, she was very independent. Was able to live independently, and she did live independently. So one of the challenges was, and we say this, I won't say it's facetiously, but not lightly. We hoped that she would sit down in a chair and just go, because the biggest challenge, especially at 99 living alone, or even at 95, was if she fell, there's an accident, what happens? And there was an incident prior to COVID where 2018, 2019, every few months, she would end up with pneumonia or respiratory illness, and people would say, she really can't live on her own. She's not taking care of herself. Fortunately, she built an incredible support network. My mother always had, but she had even though there was no family there were 2 cousins that came down in the winter for a few months. There was an aunt who lived about an hour away, but that was the only family. So my brother, all her other siblings, everybody was still in the north. And when she was, she was alone, but she built an incredible network. Her friends, people on the street, a woman from Walgreens used to take care of her. She says if you never need anything, and she'd need a ride someplace, and she would take her. So we were incredibly very fortunate for that. But to be in your mid to late 90s living alone, so prior to and this was prior to COVID, my mother, we basically came down, and we didn't force her. She said we forced her into a home. We didn't force her by any chance. We said, you either have to have some care come in, and she refused that, or she could move to an independent living. And it really was independent living. So we finally came down, and we took her, and she somewhat reluctantly.
Yes.
Beautiful place. And absolutely hated it. It was a nightmare. Yeah. It was actually worse. I would say that few months was probably worse because she was so determined not to be there.
Why did she hate it? Some of them, as you know, are like resort. It's like resort living.
Oh, absolutely. When you walked in there, it looked like a cruise ship.
Yeah.
And activities. She loved that independence. I think it was just that this meant that I was getting old and it was coming to an end. And she was 94, 95. Good news was, by being there, she actually did respond, but we told her, if she wanted to move out, and she thought she had all the faculties and the abilities to do that, she had to plan her own exit. She had to find another place. We would help her physically move, but mentally she had to go through the process. And she did. So we went down that November, 6 months later, moved her into this apartment, gorgeous apartment. We're not talking we're talking a massive two-bedroom apartment.
Yeah. But how was that any different? She was living independently, and
it was about getting meals. But she did not need an aide. This was hers. I did not need an aide. I can do everything alone. But we also knew that she was starting to, whether it was the early onset dementia, or just loss of short-term memory. But she would forget to take her medication. She'd call and she'd repeat herself, and so there were concerns at that point. But other than that, if you were met with her one-on-one, she had a very, very active social life. Almost every day she was out for lunch or dinner or theater or opera or movies or something. And then COVID hit 3 months later. And she was alone. I mean, we're talking quarantined, alone. And she was also a strong-willed, as if you haven't figured that out, very strong-willed. So no one was coming in. So people would drop things off, and fortunately she had that support network, so they made sure that she had food, but you don't know what she was doing inside there. But interesting enough, that probably kept her alive, because remember that prior year she was having all these bouts with pneumonia, upper respiratory disease. Yeah. Disease-free for almost 2 years. She was, now she was depressed, one is being quarantined, but she also watched CNN 24 hours a day, which and people would come in and say, she really shouldn't watch that. We tried to get her to watch movies. We put in a streaming service, but going back to why we're talking about this, it's very hard when we're that far away. We couldn't just check on her and then also put ourselves in danger. We were over 65, so we were in that high risk category to be able to fly down there and put ourselves at risk. And even if we flew down, we would have to be quarantined for a few days before we visited her and coming back. So it made it all that more challenging. But she did make it through COVID. It was fine and started to come out. But during that period of time, she was now 3 years older. She was starting to lose her memory, lose the short-term memory. Right. She'd keep repeating herself. She'd call 3 times a day, and just like she never called before. And it all became worrisome. But she was still independent, had this great network. But it started to get worse. And she finally relented. She said, okay, 2 hours a day, or 2 hours, 3 times a week, somebody can come in. And they did. And we lucked out. I mean, there's so much, when you talk about how bad it could have been. Yes. She found there was an aide. We were shocked that she liked this woman, because my mother was usually impeccably dressed and had a wardrobe. And this woman came in a t-shirt and shorts. And she loved her. Yeah. And she said, do you think it'd be okay if we asked Barbara to stay, what do you think, maybe 4 hours? And then it was 6 hours. So, and then it got to the point where she needed another one. She says, I know somebody. So literally there was a team that sprung up. And they were there from 8 in the morning, or from 10 in the morning until 8 at night. And peace of mind. Yes. It was there. But they were just starting to get these little, ideas of, my mother went from, I don't need anybody, to I'm worried about being alone at night. And it's like, okay, we're starting to think about that. And unfortunately, they had a fire, a false alarm, or they were testing. It wasn't a false alarm, but they were testing the system. And she walked out. They said, "Don't go anywhere. You don't have to." But my mother wouldn't listen, and she went out and she fell, which is usually the older. And she had a non-dislocated fracture of her arm, but she still wasn't going to be able to move it. So at that point, we moved her to a rehab. She went to the hospital, then to a rehab.
That must have been fun.
It was deja vu. Hated it there. Yeah. Even though she was starting to have loss of memory, she got fully alert during that period of time and hated it. She was there about 10 days, got COVID. So then she was
Is that
isolated.
where she got COVID?
Yeah.
This wasn't a second COVID.
This was the second time she had
Oh.
COVID. Yeah. So she had COVID, minor case. I mean, remarkably. I mean, she was 99 at that time. So she was there for a few days, and she was there for 5 days, and she was positive. She didn't really have a lot of symptoms, but she was positive. And then they said, okay, so they removed the quarantine, but she was isolated. I mean, the only way people could come in was fully gloved and gowned, and nobody else can do that. So we moved her back to her apartment with the conditions that that she would have 24-hour care. That was, that was required. And we called hospice. Again, just the name of hospice is like,
Yes.
And they came, but we brought them in just because it could have been long term. And it
Well, why did you call hospice rather than palliative care?
well, that's what it was. It was palliative
Okay.
care, but it was through hospice.
Yeah.
And they, they helped us with, again, being far away. What's the service that can possibly help us? She needed a hospital bed. We needed, they were going to be able to provide the care, help us with the care 24 hours. And again, we didn't have, we didn't have that advocate there full time. I mean,
Yes.
having cousins and an aunt who loved my mother, took care of her, and having all the support, having somebody there to help with those final decisions,
Yep.
to make those determinations. When you're 1,000 miles away, my brother's in New England, so he's even further away, was challenging. And so when we went through, we went through that. We were very fortunate with that. And then my mother actually rebounded for about 2 weeks, and then just declined over the next 4 or 5 weeks. But we were very fortunate. She had a long quality of life,
Yes.
the ability to work independently.
Yes.
But the fact is that we're not able to drive down the street. We're not able to
No.
even, hop on a plane and get there very easily.
Was she tech savvy? Could you do FaceTime and things like that?
FaceTime was always a little bit of a challenge. Was she tech savvy? She always used email, but toward the last few years, she was really struggling. She couldn't remember how to get on it, and she would get on, and she just didn't want to do that. She also, one other problem, which seemed minor in all this, but it's not. It's significant. She had macular degeneration. She was blind in one eye. So in addition to losing some of the mental faculties,
Correct.
She could not see at all. So she loved reading. And so even though the tech savvy, she couldn't see the screen. I mean, we had a huge screen and enlarged it. And she struggled with that. So she was losing her sight.
Was she aware that these systems were beginning
Yeah,
to
she
fail?
was, yeah.
And that must have caused depression, anxiety, anger, resentment, all of those things.
Yeah, not so much anger. She actually became a little bit softer and kinder, and now I want to say that not from the kindness standpoint, but she didn't have that anger. She was frustrated, for sure. We were all frustrated.
Sure,
it doesn't matter what age you are, but she was frustrated, but not angry at that. But all through that time, even in 2019, before we talked about moving her, and she always for some reason wanted to live in downtown Philadelphia. That was her goal, downtown Philadelphia, which we live in the Lehigh Valley, but it's not convenient. We can't just say, okay, we're going to pick up, let's go see grandma, because it's a 2-hour trip. And so she wanted to live there. She looked at a couple places and said, well, if I have to live there and pay that much money, I'm going to stay in Florida because I love being in Florida. So she stayed in Florida. Toward the end, she says, I really wish I was closer to family. And she started to talk. So when I say things, she started to say, maybe we can find a place near you. And near us was in the Lehigh Valley. But it was too late. It couldn't have been done. But unfortunately for her, and this is one of the negatives, and a consideration, and I don't know in retrospect if she would have changed her mind, but there were 3 grandchildren. She never met 2 of them.
Really?
Because she wasn't able to travel up at that point. But they probably would have visited if not every day, often, and she would have been surrounded by immediate family
Yes.
rather than friends. But then from our standpoint, fortunately COVID was over, but between January and May of this year, when things started to go down, I was busy, I was traveling, I was speaking at a few conferences, but we weren't not home. Every single week, we were in the air, either to a conference or moved from a conference to there. And then as it got closer, it was like, oh, we don't think she's going to make it. So we were on a plane every week. So fortunately, we had the freedom to do it. We had the flexibility. We had the finances. She had 24-hour care. She wasn't wealthy, but she had saved. So all these things that we were fortunate enough to have, just brought to light how challenging it is for other people beyond the emotional and mental and physical stress. Sometimes it's just not possible to be able to do it.
Yeah. You mentioned a brother. So was there family support in caring for your mother?
Yeah, when I say primary, because we weren't there, but we, at least daily, and then she had a great relationships with my wife, and they would talk, all the time. My brother and my sister-in-law, actually, my brother would go down once a year and see her, and my mother, when she was healthier, she would come up, so they would see. But the relationship, maybe I was the older sibling, or during the transition, they started to go down a little bit more, which created some challenges. The relationship between me and my mother and my brother and my mother were
decisions.
They were very different relationships.
Okay.
it was a very different relationship, and so there were some challenges. She would call and say, well, can you do something with, why is he here? And
that's not uncommon either.
No. These were all these things came to light, and you never. You hear that all the time, and certainly sibling relationships, as parents age and some people feel guilty. We had that with my wife's father too. My father-in-law passed away 2 years ago.
But he lived closer.
He lived closer, but it's still an hour and a half away. Two siblings lived. One lived, I won't say walking distance, but it was probably a 15-minute walk, but it was a mile away. And then another one lived about 15 miles away. But my wife, who we lived an hour and a half to 2 hours away, was the one who would go home to take her father to every doctor appointment. I mean, even it was a foot doctor, it was an eye doctor, it was a blood test.
Because the others weren't available or not responsive?
We won't go into that. A little bit of everything. Busy working, which is legit. But some other.
Did he go through the same process as your mother? What I mean is into palliative or hospice?
He lived in the same home. No, he lived in the same home since I dated. It was a long time ago. But I think 1950 they bought the home. Still was in that same home through 2021. It was not equipped. There was no upstairs, or there was no bath. The bathroom was upstairs, and he was a mine inspector, and there was actually a toilet, literally a toilet and a shower. No doors, nothing in the basement, because he used to come through the back entrance to wash off. Yeah, you grew up in the coal regions as well. So he would. But he lived in the home, and very, very independent. But he had trouble walking. So even and going down to the basement, which was his preferred place, it was wood step. I mean, it was not handicap. It was handicap inaccessible. It was not even for someone who was physically together. So it was always, we're just waiting for him to get the call, and but he did not. He still had his mental abilities. Physically, he was in much worse shape than my mother, but mentally, he was together. So there was always that worry, that worry of checking things out. And
did he fall?
He never fell, but at the end, he got COVID. and he was alone. He was home alone, and my wife called him to check on several times a day. He wasn't answering. The family, it's like, hey, you can go over. And it's like, we can't go over because he's got COVID. So it was like, hey, I'm going to call the police. They're going to do a wellness check. And they did, and they broke the back door, and they found him laying there. He was just too weak. They get up, and at that point, we transported him to the hospital. But the decline was rapid. I mean, he was gradually aging, rapidly aging, physically more than mentally. But mentally, he was giving up. He was, that hard point is like, I live too long. I live too long.
Ira, you're a student of behavior. You're a student of a lot of things, but you're a student of behavior and attitude, and the connection between attitude and behavior and motivation and so on. What lessons from your experience and Jerry, your wife's experience, what lessons did you draw from that? Again, I got to believe that you just closed the book and that was the end of it. You thought about this not only as God willing, a once in a lifetime, maybe twice in a lifetime experience for most of us, because most of us are caregivers, have been or will be. What lessons did you take away from this?
I guess something I've always thought of is that I like my mother, I always wanted to say, if something happens, I want to be independent. I want to have to, I don't want to be taken care of. I don't want to be, the burden to the family. And it's not to a family that loves you. It's not a burden. You want to be able to do that. But be able to have maybe the financial wherewithal, being prepared, for that. What are some of the difficult decisions? So I'm not sure it's much attitude as far as other than being prepared, thinking about this. I mean, it's going to happen. The good news is we are living longer, and we have longer quality of lives. But there's some point that our abilities are going to fade, and hopefully they're not. So I think part of it is, personally, is how can we prepare better? What can we learn not to put our children into that situation? Although it's still a struggle, because if you're still somewhat physically able and somewhat your memory's working, I'm not sure I wouldn't want, I'd want to give up my independence.
No, that's a big issue.
Yeah,
it really is.
But on the other hand, my aunt and uncle, who I was very, very close to, probably even sometimes closer to them than I was my own parents, they opted to move, they were in Upper Bucks, Montgomery maybe, into a long-term care, or not long-term care, an independent living. And it was the best thing they ever did. They loved it. And it was that social life and the activities, but being able to be, if something happened, being able to be taken care of. And so, again, it's that individual. It's just what do you want? But they made a deliberate decision that they did not want to have the children worried about that, to be able to worry about that, my cousins or other family. And so it was a brilliant move. So.
You had a lot of stress during that period because
it's exhausting.
Of your business and so on. Yeah. When I was caregiving for my wife, people would tell me, my family, my doctor, and so on, you've got to take time off. You have to take care of yourself, or you're gonna break. And then, of course, it made good sense, but I wasn't able to do it. It was 24/7.
Right.
How did you handle the stress and the other things associated with being responsible for somebody else, but in your case, remotely?
Right. Oh, the calls were intense, and then there were so many parties, and then bringing back the siblings, and now that all of a sudden there was another person that was making some of the decisions. Yeah. Where up to that point, my mother would call, make a decision, and then she would say, "Yep, I'm okay. I just want to make sure I'm okay." Now there was someone else that had to get approval, and we didn't always agree.
Well, I'm assuming she had a care team there clinicians, doctors.
Yeah, but we don't. I knew them because we'd go down. She says,
Yeah.
"Oh, we're going to the cancer doctor. We're going."
Right.
I mean, I knew all these people over 40 years because I would go down multiple times a year. And she says, "Oh, I need to," and not to say, "Oh, I want you to know my doctor." These were her friends too.
Yeah.
So she was socially.
She was an extraordinary woman.
Yeah, so every doctor, she knew the family,
Yeah.
she knew the friends, and she says, "Oh, so they know all about you." So it became a social event
Yes.
to go. So I knew, at least I could associate with the names. I knew who they were. When it came down to the end, it's like, well, she had a nephrologist, she had her internist, she had a cardiologist. I knew them all. She had an oncologist. I knew the names. I knew who they were. That made it easier. My brother did not, which isn't, good or bad, but did not. So at the end, it was still that relationship. She would call me, ask maybe because my previous career, I had a healthcare career, and she would ask some of those decisions. But that became much more complicated. Going back to your question about stress, though, yeah, it was an enormously stressful time because you just every time the phone rang, and if it wasn't somebody, it wasn't a caregiver, it wasn't my mother, it was a sibling, or it was another family member. Who had an opinion about how things could be done. Everybody was piecing this together. The only fortunate part was it happened pretty quickly. I mean, the intensity of that was unlike, well, I wouldn't say unlike yours, but the intensity of that was over a 3 or 4 month period. I mean, there were incidents coming up to that.
Yeah.
But, the intensity was just over a 3 or 4 month period. So that was, you can get, I don't know how I could have done that because some situations last for years.
Yeah.
For years. And my father-in-law's was much longer. So his was more gradual. But there were just incidents, and again, over COVID, and then we threw COVID in the middle of that. And again, when he got COVID, it was at the end. So this was almost in 2022.
We were lucky Marlene never had COVID.
Yeah.
I don't know what we would have done. Did your business suffer?
It's...
I mean, you have to respond. When you get a phone call or an email saying, can you be somewhere? You have to say yes or no.
I was virtual. You know my business.
Yeah, I know.
I was.
But you still go out. As you just came back from a trip in Texas.
Yeah. Well, I'd speak. So no, I mean we were able to take those. We didn't have to cancel. Any of those trips. But I've been virtual for 20 years.
Yeah.
So I could. If I was down, even if we were on the plane going down there, I'm attached to Wi-Fi and I can go about doing that. But there were just a couple things. I had sold part of my business last year, so I was still involved with it. But from a day-to-day basis, I didn't have to worry about that. But I go back and I'm early 70s. So I got peers that are in the situation of my mother. I mean, they need the help.
Yeah.
It's their kids taking care of them. So one of the challenges is that you're a child, but you're a child whose peers are sometimes in the situation of what our parents were.
Yeah.
And they need to be taken care of, and they're not physically able to be able to do that.
Right.
So their kids are taking care of them. So this is a really interesting time because it's not even generational, because we're at risk. We were at risk for many of the things that
there's a caregiver crisis in this country that most people don't even know about.
Yeah, but again, I mean, when you look at people between my peer group, 65 to 75 years old, many of them are the recipients of the care.
Yes.
They're not the caregivers.
Yeah.
They're the care receivers.
Yeah.
And there's irony is probably not the right word, but so there is a whole generation though of people in their 90s that the children who also maybe get, so the stress levels.
Yeah.
So we're not talking 30 and 40 years old
who
say, this is like my father passed away at 56, a lot of relatives, my grandparents, 70, 75. It's different because and that was the one thing that my mother, talk about attitude changes. Yeah. Her parents died her father died at 70, her mother died at 75. Okay. Oh. She says, when I had to do this, I had to, because my grandmother lived in Florida, I had to go down and take care of my your grandmother. She was 40.
I would thank you very much. I appreciate your spending the time.
Thank you.
My guest today is Ira Wolf, a friend and a business associate who was a caregiver and who lived through it. Until next time, this is Caregiver Assist. I'm Rick Anthony. Take very good care of yourselves.